So, what if your absolute worst nightmare was literally just Tuesday? I mean, seriously, take a second and imagine a world where the stuff that makes your skin crawl today, skulls stacked in your living space, agonizing medical pain, totalitarian surveillance, were just everyday background noise. Sounds impossible, right? But here's the thing. Human beings possess this terrifying superpower. We have the ability to adapt to absolutely anything.
Welcome to this explainer. Today we're diving into the hidden logic of history's extremes. The whole overarching thesis here is actually pretty simple. Humans don't live in an objective reality. We can, and we absolutely will, normalize anything if our environment demands it. We're going to look at historical practices that seem utterly insane to us right now and figure out exactly why, to the people actually living through them, they made flawless, perfect sense.
Here's our roadmap for today. First, the practicality of horror. Second, power on a platter. Third, the empire of speed. And finally, competence on the step. Let's get right into it.
Section 1. The practicality of horror.
All right, imagine stepping into a medieval town where death was literally a quiet neighbor you might step over on your way to buy bread. You see, in medieval Europe, graveyards filled up incredibly fast. There simply wasn't enough space. So the highly practical medieval mind improvised with something called an ossuary. Instead of endless graveyard sprawl, old graves were dug up and the bones were recycled. People cheerfully organized their ancestors' skulls into church walls as basically a space-saving interior design solution. You'd walk into a chapel, nod respectfully to a wall of femurs stacked like firewood, and just pray. To them, it wasn't creepy at all, it was just efficient bone management. Death had a place, and that place had shelves. And this mindset totally bleeds over into healthcare. Today, we expect modern medicine to give us sterile tools, comfort, and anesthesia. But medieval medicine? It was built on the bold, terrifying assumption that healing literally required suffering. If a doctor, who, by the way, was often just the local barber, cut your arm off with unwashed tools while you were wide awake, your screaming wasn't a bad thing. Actually, screaming meant you were still alive. Silence was what terrified them. They firmly believed that routine bloodletting and enduring massive amounts of pain was the only logical path to keeping your body balanced and healthy.
So without microscopes, how did they diagnose you? Well, medieval doctors used their own senses to evaluate a nice, warm flask of a patient's urine. They check the warmth, inspect the color, evaluate the smell, but here is the kicker. Step 4, they literally sampled the taste. Yep, a quick sip to test for sweetness or bitterness. And patients totally trusted this. Medical texts seriously debated urine slavers. To a medieval person, this wasn't disgusting, it was just a really thorough checkup. Honestly, if your doctor didn't taste your urine, you'd probably think they were a complete fraud.
Which brings us to a darkly comedic extreme of medieval logic: animal trials. If a pig destroyed property or injured a child, that pig could actually be arrested. It would be given a defense attorney who'd argue its case in court with absolute deadpan professionalism. And if found guilty, the pig might be dressed up in human clothes and publicly hung. From our modern perspective, this sounds like an absurd comedy sketch, but to them, it was profoundly comforting. It meant the world made sense, chaos was managed, responsibility applied to literally everyone and everything. It wasn't about cruelty, it was about maintaining cosmic order.
Moving on to Section 2. Power on a platter. So, what happens when you apply this intense, bizarre logic to the absolute pinnacle of society? Well, welcome to the opulent halls of royalty, where food wasn't about hunger, it was heavily weaponized. If you wanted to show your dominance, you didn't just serve a meal, you served a spectacle. Enter the royal peacock. Now, peacock meat is notoriously tough. It's practically inedible, but that was the whole point. To prepare it, they'd roast the bird, meticulously reattach its skin and feathers, gild its beak with real gold, and rig it with alcohol-soaked wicks so it could literally breathe fire. This was not dinner. It was a massive theatrical announcement that a ruler had such endless resources they could afford to waste highly skilled labor on something literally nobody wanted to eat.
At these banquets, the furniture was effectively the deadliest weapon in the room. Your physical distance from the ruler dictated your political survival. If you sat close, you got hot, high-quality food, and it signaled high trust. If you sat far away, your food arrived cold and picked over, signaling to everyone in the room that you were politically irrelevant. A single chair moved just a few feet could announce your sudden downfall without a single word ever being spoken. Power, quite literally, just rearranged the furniture.
And the ultimate, undeniable flex of this financial muscle was the subtlety.
Back then, sugar was impossibly rare, imported across massive global trade routes. So naturally, what did rulers do? They had it melted down to build gigantic, edible statues of castles and dragons. These massive sugar sculptures were placed on the table purely to be admired, then broken apart, distributed strictly by rank, and basically destroyed. Turning the rarest substance in Europe into a temporary shattered monument proved you controlled not just wealth, but global geography.
Section 3. The Empire of Speed. Speaking of controlling geography, how on earth do you rule a territory stretching from Eastern Europe all the way to East Asia without losing control the second you turn your back? For the Mongol Empire, the answer was the Yam. This was a permanent, empire-wide relay network of stations and horses designed for relentless speed. Waiting weeks for military intelligence was a death sentence for a sprawling empire, so the Mongols engineered this incredible circulatory system of information, placing stations stocked with fresh supplies every few miles across the entire continent.
And the absolute most crucial metric for this entire system? 0. That is exactly the amount of rest a message got. When a courier arrived at a station, they didn't stop for a drink or a quick nap. No way. They handed the message to a fresh rider or hopped onto a fresh horse and just kept moving. They swapped horses seamlessly without any sentimentality. They wouldn't push one horse until it died. They rotated them constantly so those imperial orders could keep flying across the steppe at absolute maximum velocity.
To make this work, the riders had to be completely untouchable. Yam couriers carried these metal immunity passes. When they rode into a town, local rules simply stopped applying to them. They could bypass checkpoints, demand immediate fresh horses, and commandeer food and shelter on the spot. And the locals complied instantly, because stopping a Yam messenger was effectively declaring war on the Khan himself. The entire empire literally moved at the speed of these riders.
Section 4. Competence on the steppe.
Now, the Yam wasn't the only thing the brutal steppe environment demanded. Out there, survival was a daily negotiation with a hostile world. If you couldn't contribute, you were a massive liability. So while Mongol men were away on campaigns for months or even years, the women took over. They managed the massive herds, which, by the way, was the entire economy. They packed and moved the heavy nomadic camps, negotiated complex trade deals, and physically defended the camps from raiders. They were the logistical and economic backbone that kept the empire from collapsing. Competence mattered way, way more than any rigid gender ideal.
And this setup caused some major culture shock. When foreign diplomats from settled empires showed up, they fully expected rigid hierarchies and secluded women with purely symbolic power. Imagine their absolute shock when they were forced to sit down and negotiate complex, binding trade deals directly with formidable Mongol wives, women who rode horses, managed massive wealth, and gave direct orders. To the outsiders, it seemed completely uncivilized. But to the Mongols, it was just basic survival. If you can do the job, you do the job.
There's this quote that perfectly captures the Mongol ethos. When survival is uncertain, ideology bends, roles expand, and authority follows ability. The ultimate proof of this system wasn't just managing camps. It was ruling the empire itself. During rocky succession periods, female regents, often the widows of Khans, stepped up and ruled the entire Mongol empire. They issued orders, managed diplomacy, and oversaw military logistics. They absolutely weren't figureheads. They held real authority because their society valued stability and tangible results way more than strict patriarchy.
So, let's zoom out and connect all these dots. From medieval Europeans calmly worshipping next to a wall of skulls and drinking urine for a health check, to the lethal political theater of a fire-breathing peacock, to female steppe lords commanding the greatest land empire in human history, the underlying thread is exactly the same. Humans adapt. We flawlessly normalize whatever extreme our era throws at us. What seems horrifying, absurd, or revolutionary to us was, to them, simply the most logical way to survive a Tuesday.
And that brings us to our final, lingering thought. You know, it's so easy to look back at history and judge their version of normal. But the mirror flips both ways. Look around your life, your routines, your society. What are we tolerating right now? What are we living with that feels perfectly normal to us today, but that future generations will look back on and find absolutely unbelievably horrifying? I'm going to leave you to think about that. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning your normal.